So thank you again for coming. And of course there's an element of bragging associated with the study, not least because it is Kantar's biggest. It's their, without question, strongest demonstration of the power of brands and our association and understanding of brands when you realize the background to the BrandZ study. It's been running since 1998. We've been doing a standard platform of methodological approach to evaluating brand equity over the course of those years. And then indeed in 2001 we started to do actual brand valuations. We launched our first global BrandZ valuation study based not just on consumer input but also on the financial value of brands contributing to their companies. And indeed that has become a larger and larger part of how companies evaluate the power of their brand. And the figures clearly are mind-blowing, and indeed I'll talk about the extent to which they are equally large or getting larger within the South African context as well. But fundamentally underpinning BrandZ is that it illustrates our understanding of everything about brand, because when push comes to shove, brands are in the hearts and minds of our consumers. And the perceptions of the brands are what make them strong, and it's what us as marketers spend our lives trying to work out how best we can strengthen that brand in order that we can sell more. And any questions around the power of that, we will allay over the course of the day, because quite clearly we have seen time and again that brand equity is one of the fundamental leverages of brand growth. So, without being too boring to start, I do have to give you the underpinnings of the exercise that we call BrandZ by demonstrating that in fact we have a two-step process to the evaluation of the brand value. We first start with an evaluation of the contribution of the brand to a company in terms of its valuation by looking at the Bloomberg data, stripping out the brand contribution and tying that back with various sources of information that we have within Kantar, such as the World Panel Base. We then do bespoke research around our MDF framework, meaningfully different salient framework, which allows us to look at a power of the brand and the proportion of the financial value that can be attributed to the particular brand. And that is done in 51 countries around the world, including South Africa, and has been consistently for 13, 14 years. It's an extraordinary, powerful database. And indeed, albeit I'm going to make this point on a number of occasions, the fact is that you are able not just to look within this database at the top 30 brands that we happen to be isolating here, but also at the 500 plus brands that we've evaluated over the course of the last 18 years in South Africa. So it's an enormous body of evidence that you should be asking your friendly Kantar's client service execs to come and talk to you about, should you have any need to have any further insight into your brand. So that's how we get to the brand valuation, and obviously I've boasted a little bit about this, but it is extraordinary to see that the total value of brands in the world, and I'm focusing at this moment on global, is $4.7 trillion. That's a fairly extraordinary number. It's also the combined GDP of the countries Spain, South Africa and Russia, would you believe it? And to give you some context for that, we have a brand valuation, we have a GDP in South Africa of around 380 odd billion. So clearly, brands play an enormous part in contributing to the GDP of countries, and indeed, look at this picture. The power of brands is clearly equally growing. Back in 2001, $1.4 trillion. Steady growth, albeit at different levels and growth paths over the course of the interim period, where we now arrive at some 4.7 trillion, up 7%, which indeed, it has to be said, is less than we've seen in previous years, but nevertheless is a significant growth and higher than GDP growth globally by a significant margin. Clearly, again, illustrating the power of brands to drive growth in businesses and countries. And indeed, we are, in South Africa, relatively strongly contributed to by our brand valuation as a proportion of our GDP. And a killer slide, the one that actually should be here, and you're going to see on a number of occasions over the course of today or this morning, one that I personally think justifies my existence, and anybody in marketing's existence as well. It is the most extraordinary chart, and if anybody ever argues with you about what your job is about, refer to slide here. Okay. So what does it say? It's effectively a scale from 2006 to now, looking at the stock market value of average companies, as indicated by the MSCI World Index, and what has happened over the course of that period of time. It would have, if you'd started in 2006, grown by 59% to date this year. With me? If you took the S&P 500, you'd have seen 128% growth. Had you taken the top 100 brands, or companies that owned the top 100 brands, you would have grown your portfolio by 196%. Had you taken the top 10 companies out of that portfolio, you would have grown it by 317. So, when you think about your financial advisor, and he tells you you should be investing in X, Y, Z, you say, rubbish. What we should be investing in is the 10 companies behind the 10 biggest growing brands in the world, as defined by BrandZ. And you would have done a hell of a lot better, I guarantee, than 99% of you have by taking advice from your average financial advisor. So there you go. It's been worthwhile coming today. Already, I can demonstrate this point to you. Oh, whoops. That is my global CEO telling me that I've actually breached some covenant or internal policy. I've always somewhat regretted that I didn't catch on to this a little earlier, in truth, but nevertheless, sorry, I'm being a little flippant. The bottom line is, quite clearly, that brands are an amazing lever on the power of companies to grow. And I'm sure we all knew that, but this is the classic illustration. So when your CEO or CFO argues about your job, you tell them, I'm terribly sorry. Okay. Onwards, and I hate to just reinforce this point, but clearly within our study we are able to start to look at enormous numbers of breakdowns, and indeed I'd happily spend hours talking to you about this stuff. But if we just look globally, it's interesting, if we take those scores, we have a cumulative equity score, which we call our power index. If you take the lowest and compare it to the highest, more than 3 you will see as a result of being a strong equity brand. What better justification for making sure you build your equity? And let's look at some of those most powerful brands again, because they are the most extraordinary collection of companies. It's not easy achieving some of these results, but equally clearly, look at some of these pictures. Clearly, from the bottom, we have an AT&T running all the way through to the first time this year, Amazon achieving the #1 slot at $315 billion worth of brand value. If that isn't mind-blowing, what is? It is quite an extraordinary number. And when you think about equally the fact that over the years we have increasingly seen the growth of tech, ultimately, Amazon is a bit of a retail. It came from retail roots. It revolutionized the whole approach to retail, and its reward is that after 10 years of duopoly between Google and Apple, they have leapt into the #1 spot. An extraordinary performance, and we'll probe into it in a little bit more detail in a second or two. Clearly there is still a preponderance of technology brands, and also financial, in the payment space, and indeed a couple of other little interlopers. But what is clear is that for the big ones, for the big one, namely Amazon, it isn't just a function, as you all know, of selling books online. It may have been our first exposure to the Amazon, but my God, has it crept into almost all facets of our lives. And I say that in the full knowledge that in South Africa we have very little connection with Amazon. But boy, has it made an effect over the entire world, and I'm absolutely confident it'll be here soon. But they actually operate across an ecosystem of in excess of 12, 15 different areas, all of which have been basically taking their original area and looking at around the edges where they can grow and identify growth opportunities. And they've exploited them relentlessly. They have not ever said, nope, we haven't won here, we're going elsewhere. They've always kept pursuing it. I mean, you know, Prime, clearly an enormous moneymaker for them. Echo, many people will overseas be using the voice-activated service. Your Amazon Go, which apparently is their clicks and mortar offering, where you can just walk out of the store without paying, and then bing, bing, suddenly you get the bill. But clearly, extraordinarily impressive. And Amazon Web Services, which I believe are actually two floors down from us, and actually occupy at least a couple of those floors, based on their cloud-based services, which I gather almost provide half the profit of the overall organisation. I'm not suggesting that downstairs 2 floors do, but as a combination of business, apparently, it is indeed truly extraordinary. So a lesson perhaps for us about the ability of brands to build via an ecosystem around their core competencies. Something that in many cases we ought to be looking at as marketers ourselves to say, where can we grow? And looking at those opportunities, in some cases in the tech space. So clearly, there has been a revolution, not least demonstrated by the upsurge of Amazon across the brands over the past 10 years. And this just takes, well, in fact, a bit more, 12 years. It looks at where the top 10 were in 2006 versus where they are now. Take a second to digest, but boy, there clearly are some names which have shifted fairly dramatically over the course of that period of time. Can you be surprised, perhaps, to see that General Electric, a company which was a huge holding company, but ultimately was based on the valuation of good old aero engines, fridges, and cookers, and had been a staple part of the diet of Americans for many, many generations, have seen a drop-off, and you may have seen them on the list, but way, way down. They're still there. Other bespoke brands necessarily aren't, as a matter of interest, as we'll see. So GE not there, Coke not in the top 10. China Mobile, interesting enough, not Marlboro. What a sad day for me when that went, as much as passing interest. There we go. Even your Toyotas of this world, you may have noticed as you went through as you saw that list, that there were extraordinarily motor vehicles. Automotive industry has taken an enormous knock in terms of its valuations, because the differentiation of brands in that category have become significantly lower. In other words, brands are ultimately less powerful in that space. Does that make some sense? So, extraordinary transformation. Indeed, here we see really only one solid FMCG brand in the form of good old McDonald's. So it's extraordinary how the world has changed over this period. So how would your investment have to have changed? The answer is significantly over that period. If you're still in all these legacy stocks, I'm not saying you wouldn't still be doing very well, because they're still in the top 100, but not as well as you would have done had you shifted into an Amazon brand 10 years ago. And you'd be making some very serious money indeed. Top 10 rises this year, i.e. these are the ones that have strong growth, or shown the strongest growth over the course of this year, led by Instagram, over on the left here. So you think, okay, super, another technology brand, albeit social. And then you say, well, okay, the next one up is an apparel brand. So yes, it's not that there is a concentration just in tech. Lululemon is a, would you believe it, yoga clothing brand. In fact, those of you who saw Nigel's presentation last year may remember him talking about this. I don't think he anticipated that it would be growing that amount when we come back a year later. But actually, apparently, I hasten to add, this is not something that's going to come my way in the near future. In New York and other civilized cities around the world, people go to work in their Lululemon, have a yoga session, and carry on working because it's so smart. This is not Lululemon. Nor is it likely to be in the near future. But suffice to say, indeed a great collection of different brands, all of which, without question, you can look at and say they have some purpose. They know exactly what they're trying to do and achieve. Netflix, increasingly perhaps creeping into our consciousness, many people here will at least have played with the free offerings such as I have. Salesforce, Adobe, Shiseido, a personal care company, Amazon, clearly massive growth, the Ubers, LinkedIns of this world have all done extraordinarily well. So those were top 10 rises, and let's have a quick look at which ones are the newbies. So what came into the top 100 index for the first time? Chanel, Lick. Lick is an Indian insurance company. It's a matter of passing interest. Didi, that is a ride-hailing service. Get the drift. Chinese equivalent of Uber, apparently, and indeed in lots of better than. Okay, I confess that I haven't actually seen it, but suffice to say, we have a Chinese lifestyle program. Dell will be familiar with Xbox, Hire, what used to be a sort of GEC equivalent in terms of the domestic space of domestic appliances now got into all sorts of areas where, would you believe it, from hire, you can get clothes which tag and tell you when you should be actually putting them in the washing machine. I mean, that really is quite scary shit. Maybe put your Lululemon into your hire when you finish having had your yoga session. It's an extraordinary world that we're coming up to. And this is a Chinese brand. And as a matter of passing interest, I was privileged enough to be in China quite recently, went round a whole range of technology-based companies, and I was just blown away by the innovation that they are looking at leveraging in almost every aspect of life as it touches the masses. Really quite extraordinary. So, clearly, these are all basically purpose-driven, strong brands which have, for the first time, appeared on the list. And indeed, when you look at what happened, let's look, unfortunately, at the slightly more negative picture. Which brands have dropped out? Well, there are some characteristics associated. Let's start with that, of brands that have fallen out. If we index all brands at 100, the top 100 brands, indexed in terms of our three core measures around our equity measure called salience, meaningful, and difference, the other way around for some reason, you see we're all way over-indexed because, of course, they are in the top 100, or should I say cause-effect, chicken and egg, you understand the logic. But those brands that have dropped out have not dropped out because people don't know about them. They've dropped out because they're no longer meaningful and they no longer have the same degree of differentiation in people's lives. Doesn't that make sense? It just makes such perfect sense that they would be starting to become less relevant and therefore drop off people's perceptions as being a good reason to buy those brands. 52 have disappeared over the years, and would you believe it, this year, albeit we try not to talk about brands that have fallen off the list, I can tell you, however, that globally, Ford, no longer there. Honda, no longer there. Pepsi, no longer there. Seriously scary when you think about what can happen if you don't continue to activate your brand and push relevance, innovation across your portfolio of brands. So let's have a quick look, and here indeed is a story about the brands that the level that was required to get into the top 100. If you had been back in 2006, Hennessy was the 100th brand on the top 100 list, and it had a value just over $4 billion. Over the interim period, these are the bottom or the 100th brand every year. And it is clearly interesting to see that over that period, we have seen an enormous growth in the levels required to get to that entry point. I'm afraid I do have to reflect that locally, back in 2016, 14, MTN was on the global list. It had a valuation of $10 billion. And I'm afraid, leaping ahead of myself, we all know they had some trials and tribulations, but wow, they are now not even at the top of the South African list. Clearly, external circumstances in Nigeria and other areas have had a major effect on them, but actually their brand valuation is now 2.3 billion, and indeed positioned, to leap ahead of myself a little, at some 2.3 billion. So let's focus just a little bit on South Africa and the study that we have done for you here in its second year of valuation. I hasten to add again, I stress we've been doing the work for the period and contributing to the global brand study, but we've only done the valuations, which requires a lot of very clever analytics people who both pull all the financial data from locally and around the world and also do all sorts of pointy-headed things that you and I don't really understand. However, we have an extremely clever analytics team, which is a matter of passing interest you should always consider utilising when it comes to such exercises. And indeed, the data analysis has been re-stressed on that, and indeed, we, as you probably are aware, albeit that we have trials and tribulations in South Africa, we are still the 31st biggest country by GDP in the world. And I was actually particularly proud to be able to twist Eric's arm to make sure that we became the 11th country in the world to do a brand valuation. And indeed, we beat, on that particular basis, the latest two entrants to the market, which are coming up in the near future, namely Japan and Canada. So, sod them, we beat you. Natural passing interest. To re-stress, have evaluated over 550 brands across 40 categories. And that data we can give you access to / you can come and ask for it. And I hasten to add, that might require that we speak to you very nicely, or you speak to us very nicely, but we may well be able to give you some reflection on how your brand has performed over time in some cases. Okay. We did over 25,000 interviews this year, and indeed we arrived at a valuation of $37.14 billion. Now, those of you who have great memories will know that that is actually down from last year. And that is obviously the sad news as far as BrandZ is reflecting for South Africa this year. It's actually down by some 13%, which is not an insignificant fall, albeit there are other countries around the world which have fallen. But I'm afraid our harsh economic times, our exchange rate valuation, because this is a study done in dollars, and indeed with JSE's performance, have all contributed to the decline in valuations seen overall. But I stress that one of the great areas of interest out of this is that brands have proved to be more resilient than some of those macro factors. So yet again, as per my never forget slide, you will recognize that brands have a strength and ability to show resilience and bounce back that much quicker than those brands which are not basically part of people's lives in the perceptions of the strength of those brands. So, yes, indeed, we've seen some significant shifts, but I hope that I've re-stressed the point, and I'm sorry to bang on about this, but it is clearly the gold standard of such valuations because it does indeed take consumer plus the financial data into account. It's had those validated links done with growth over an enormous number of data points over the years. It is indeed used by analysts to actually make financial decisions. So actually, you should be asking your financial analyst whether he's plugging this data in to his financial plans for you. And if he's not, well, give him a hard time. And I should also just, and this is sort of a little trumpet blow, can we not do this? The fact is that it is statistically more difficult to become a BrandZ global top 100 brand than to win an Oscar. So if you appear as your company on this list, you are at the beginnings of the point of becoming an Oscar winner. Okay, just a final couple of points. BrandZ reflects brands born in South Africa. Okay, so you don't see Coke here. You don't see Unilever because it doesn't reflect holding companies. Understand that. It's the brand we're interested in. We're interested in knowing how powerful the brand is specifically, and that's for very good reasons, because we as Kantar spend an enormous amount of time giving people advice around brands, the equity they've built up, and how best to leverage those brands in future. I couldn't care, in the nicest possible way, how well Unilever is doing. I want to know how well Dove is doing, how well Sunlight's doing, and what they can do to leverage their performance in future. So, as a big data source, I'm incredibly proud that we've been able to bring this here. I'm incredibly proud that we've got our second year's results. And I'm afraid I'm going to keep you on tenterhooks a little longer in terms of the results themselves. And I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague.